Okay, so I first need to ask if there is anyone in the audience who do not understand Danish. Okay, because then we can do this debate in English. It was originally planned to do it in Danish, but I think we can accommodate. I'm looking at my panelists, and they all feel like they can do this. So we're going to have a short debate here tonight, just an hour, like a lot of the other conversations. We are going to talk about nuclear energy, dangers, or the future. So the way this is going to work is that first we'll hear who we have in the panel, then they will present their opening statement, present their position on this field, tell us what do they think. Is it the future or is it a danger? So we can say where are our different panelists. And then we are going to have a discussion where we can explore these different perspectives. And if you sit in the audience and feel like I have a question or I have a comment, I need to add something to the debate right now, you just raise your hand and then someone will come running with a microphone. But do not ask a question before you have a microphone. Okay? Perfect. So, the topic for this debate is, as I said, nuclear energy, dangers, or the future. So, who do we have in our panel? Would you like to start here in the end?
Sure, I can do that. My name is Mads. I am 26 years old, and I am a board member and speaker of Foreningen Atomkraft i Attack, so that we are the pro-nuclear advocates of Denmark, and we are a volunteer organization who look to basically destigmatize in order to mitigate climate change, and that is what we're trying to do here. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
And this is where it gets difficult, because my name is also Mats Christensen, and I'm the executive director of Greenpeace in the Nordic area. And Greenpeace is an environmental organization that has worked for 50 years now for a green and peaceful future for the planet, and have been against the use of nuclear energy practically, if not for 50 years, then at least for 40-ish years.
Do I have a mic? Yes. Thank you. My name is Jakob, just to make it a little bit more easy on the panel. I'm educated as a lawyer, and I have worked as a lawyer for 12 years and until I became elected into the Danish Parliament from the Conservative People's Party. And I was member of Parliament for 6 years. I was minister for about half that period. I have been Minister of Transport and Energy, but I am the shortest sitting minister in that period, but only 72 days. And after that, I became Minister of Health, and I was Minister of Health for nearly about 3 years. And for the last 11 years, I have been CEO in 1 year in a private hospital, and for the last about 10 years, I have been CEO in a very big real estate development company. So that's what I am now, but I am, when we are getting an election in Denmark next, maybe it's from tomorrow, or maybe it's within the next 6-7 weeks, I will be on the list, not for the EPP as standing here, but for the Danish Parliament once again. That's about me.
Thank you. And now I'm going to make it a little more difficult, because we have a Mads and a Mads and a Jakob and a Jakob. So this is just the way that it is going to be today. I'll be your moderator for this debate. I'm Jakob Blasius. I am international officer in the Danish Student Union. Now we are going to hear your opening statements. So Jakob, would you like to start and present your view on this field?
You are asking nuclear energy dangerous or the future? And I will say it's the future. I think the issue about nuclear has a lot of feelings. We all have seen on TVs, of course, the smoke from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We know that it is spreading very much. We all have heard about Chernobyl, and that the disaster came through to Denmark. But I think it's a lot of feelings, because if we do it with the correct technology, we are able to, that the worst case scenario is, we are able to handle worst case scenario. And one of the biggest problems that the whole world is standing to is the climate crisis. And I do not believe that we will be able to reduce CO2 without using nuclear energy. There is, of course, wind and the sun, and that's good, and the wind is good here up in Scandinavia, but about equator, there is 3 to 4 billion people living there, and the wind is not blowing. If we want to win the battle in the climate crisis, there is no way out, as I see it, from nuclear energy. Do you agree?
No.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's a super complicated question about nuclear energy, because this is not a question about for or against, right? Because we have nuclear energy in the world today, and there is being built nuclear energy at the moment, right? So this is part of the world, right? So I think the real question here is this the solution that we should invest much more in and scale up to a level where it can actually act as something that can replace solar and wind, or have it provide a real difference in our energy mix, right? And I think we have to be super honest about this. I mean, nuclear energy doesn't play a big role today, right? And it's going down. It's somewhere around 10% of our electricity production, right? And approximately half of that, if you look at the whole contribution to our energy mix in the world, and it's going down, right? Because there's or it's stable, you could argue, but that depends on how you look at it. But it's not going up significantly. And even the most sort of progressive scenarios or most optimistic scenario for what is possible, we are talking about perhaps a doubling of that, right? And at the same time, we are seeing that we, in 2021, produced more energy from solar and wind than we did from nuclear. And that's rising exponential, right? Because it's cheaper, because it's safer, because we can fit it into our energy mix all over the world. There's not 3 billion people that lives in areas where it's not solar or wind. There are some places, but it's not 3 billion. The energy scenarios that clearly shows how we can do without. I think it's not only about emotions, but it is as well, right? Because I would say the emotional element for me is that I really don't think that we should solve one generational problem, the climate crisis we're in right now, where previous generations has left a problem to the next generation, with another generational problem as nuclear is, right? That leaves a legacy of nuclear waste for coming generations. I think that's simply a wrong decision. And on top of that, you have 4 other problems with nuclear that is quite, and I'm sure we will get through them, but it's basically that there is risks associated, even if newer plants are becoming more safe than the previous generations, no doubt about it. Then it's the waste problem, but it's also the problem of proliferation of nuclear material that can be used in military purposes. And it is, fourthly, the issue of cost, where we see no matter if we look at the most positive and optimistic cost scenarios, then it's still more expensive to build new nukes compared to solar and wind, even with backup capacity and redundancy capacity that is needed for also solar and wind, as well as for nuclear. And then fifthly, it is a matter of scale. It is simply not possible to bring so much nuclear capacity on the grid as is needed. Every idiot in the world practically can build a windmill and a solar panel, but not every idiot can build a nuclear power station, right? So there is a real scale issue, and there's a time problem here. So I think for me it's more about being, let's be cool about this, right? We don't have to put a lot of emotions into this or have a super heated issue, because nuclear is here and it's not dogmatic about it. If someone came with a solution and said, now we actually found the solution to these 5 problems, I guarantee I would be the first one to put my hand up and say, yes, I hope that happens. Yeah. That's not where we are today.
And our last panelist?
Well, we need nuclear because it is the only low carbon energy source that we can actually turn up and down. As the two previous speakers have talked about, we do have a lot of windmills in Denmark, and the wind blows quite often and a lot. Any Danish person can sign to that. But when you look at the actual numbers, 50% of our electricity consumption is from windmills, but electricity only accounts for 20% of our total energy consumption. So while Denmark proclaims itself as a green leader, we have only really gotten 10% of the way since we started. The biggest, the quickest, the most vast energy transitions that have ever been made in the history of man is with nuclear. And it wasn't due to climate change, it was simply because we didn't want to be dependent on oil during our last energy crisis. France and Sweden and Switzerland all get more than 40% of their total energy consumption from nuclear, and that means that they emit way less CO2 than we do. Even if you do focus on the electricity, our electricity is much more carbon intensive in Denmark than it is in Sweden, Switzerland, or France. In regards to safety, the Joint Research Committee of the European Union, when assessing the dangers and risks of nuclear power, actually found out that third generation of nuclear, which is what is currently being built in the Western societies, is the safest form of energy that we have ever had, ever. Even safer than wind and solar. The nuclear problem that are being described with the waste, well, how many people died from the nuclear waste? It is not a green gooey mass, it is simply a radioactive metal that you put into the reactor and then you take it out again. It has never killed anyone in Western societies. That is in stark contrast to fossil fuels, which still account for the vast majority of energy that is being produced. The waste from these burnings, which is also 90% of Danish energy consumption, is simply deposited straight into the atmosphere and down into our lungs. 8.7 million people die every single year from air pollution, just from energy production. This is a huge issue, and the hypothetical deaths of a few in 100,000 years from radioactive waste does not really hold a candle to the actual risks that we have from our current energy paradigm today. Wind and solar are great technologies, but we need nuclear as well because we need CO2-free, particle pollution-free backup capacity, and we cannot dig up all the minerals on Earth to make batteries and backup storage. Gas from Putin and biomass from burning forests is not green. Nuclear is green, and that is the scientific consensus.
Thank you so much. So, we'll go a lot more into details, but we have already brought so many of the arguments on one side and the other side on the table. I think we should be very careful about making this a black or white question, because that's also what I hear you say. This is a complicated discussion. So let's try to go into the different dilemmas and then the questions about where you differ. So I feel like this whole question about nuclear energy was something that we had kind of moved on from. At least it seemed to be at least in public discourse, that we were like, oh, that was something in the past, we tried, now we are talking about solar panel or wind or something like that. But now it's coming back, or do you view it differently? Do you see it's just something that we forgot about in our political conversations? Is it because there is a need for it now, or how do you see it? Can you maybe share your reflections on this? Maybe if you can start in the middle this time.
Sure. It is true that...
sorry, in the middle.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
But it was a mess.
Just like...
Yeah, but we're taking the debate again in Denmark and a few other places, right? And for us, it feels like this is something that is fairly new because we put it behind us, and I think, in my view, it is behind us because you don't have any serious players in Denmark that think we should have nuclear in Denmark, right? There's no of the corporations that could build nuclear that want to do that in Denmark. There's none of the politicians, at least not a majority, or at least I would say 75% of parliament don't want it, right? For good reasons. I mean, we have other solutions in Denmark. So, and even the nuclear companies we have in Denmark says no, right? The Seaborg says that's not for Denmark. So it depends on what we mean when we talk about nuclear, right? Because I appreciate that this is a more live discussions in some parts of the world, right? Where it's a bigger real alternative than it is for us. We have the batteries in Norway in water capacity. We have our renewable energies. There's absolutely no point in us building nuclear here. But I think it's completely valid to have the conversation. I mean, it is a generational thing as well, right? I mean, the generation before had the conversation, came to their conclusion. Now there's a new generation, a new crisis. So let's have it again. That's fine. I think the picture globally is very mixed, right? There's countries where you have very clear rejections of nuclear, and there are countries that are reopening the conversation again. So I think it's a very mixed picture. But I think it's fair to say that right now we don't see a nuclear renaissance or a nuclear sort of flow of new reactors coming on, right? The last 10 years we've seen between 1 and 8 reactors coming online every year, and approximately a similar amount going off the grid, right? So that's what I mean with this is sort of floating around. I think last year we added 5 gigawatt nuclear to the mix, and the year before it was a minus. So it goes up and down. There's no nuclear renaissance globally, but it is being built, and it is a live discussion, and I think that's okay.
Jakob?
Well, being a former member of parliament, I have discovered that there's a lot of parliamentary members who is for something when they are not on the stage, and they are against it when they are on the stage, because there's a kind of feeling that they are afraid of the voters saying they have to brand the discussion. And at the very moment, actually the way we lived just 5 years ago, you cannot get the voters with you. It would be unpopular to say something in favor of nuclear energy. So, but I really think there is an underscore of a lot of parliamentary members in all parties who is thinking about this now. And why? Is that there's 2 fundamental headlines in our energy policy that we have to be aware of. First, you cannot put hundreds of millions of dollars to dictators or autocrats in the Middle East, and you cannot continue being dependent on Mr. Putin. So that's that. 25 years ago, we discussed the energy policy as a matter that we have to get our consumption fulfilled. It's not the matter anymore. It's becoming what we in Denmark call storpolitik. It's security policy. It interests presidents and prime ministers because it's security policy. And that's because we have to get independent, and we have to be independent very fast. The other very important headline is to reduce the carbon emission. That's also something which is going to be very fast. And I am actually I don't think this discussion is against sun and windmills. You are not saying so. I'm talking about a mixture. Actually, I'm putting my own money into sun energy at the very moment. So I hope there will be a consumption for it. But we have to get a mix. And if we are going to regard this as independency, we have to have this bottom buffer at our total consumption of energy. That is going to be the fossil produced energy has to be changed with something with its low on carbon, and that's only nuclear power. And we have to do it very fast because we have to win this battle for the climate, and we have to win this battle of being independent of the dictators in the Middle East and Putin. That's a battle we have to win very fast. Very fast.
I would like to give it to Mads from Atomkraft Yatak, but I feel like this demands a response from Mads in the middle first.
I simply, of course, we can agree, and we don't have to talk about that, whether we think that we should combat climate change. I mean, I've been in a business that worked for that for 30 years, right? And of course, that's a given. We all agree this is a planetary crisis we're in the middle of.
You don't have to say that.
And we need to act now, right? Renewables can deliver much faster than the nuclear can, right? It takes somewhere between, if we were fast, 1 to 2 years with a windmill park, and it will take 10 years if we're very fast with the nuclear as well, right? So it's a completely different response time. But I find it, what really puzzles me in this debate is that it's in this moment in time where we're discussing nuclear again, right? I mean, we have the biggest nuclear power station in Europe right now under siege by Russia and being used as a bomb cover by our Russian colleagues. We have the lobby organization of nuclear, the International Nuclear Energy Agency, that is basically shouting alarm and saying it's critical what's happening, right? At the same time, we have 30 nuclear reactors in France off the grid, either because they have construction faults that has been found in their cooling system, or because climate change and the drought has made it impossible to cool them down, right? At the same time, we have a number of countries, including Germany, that says, no, even if we wanted to, it's not possible for us to restart these reactors. And we have 3 reactors, three new build reactors in Western Europe, Olkiluoto and Flamanville and Hinkley Point in the UK, that has been delayed. I mean, don't even get me started on that. I think Olkiluoto is 3 times its original cost, right? It's more than 15 billion euros for that plant alone. The Hinkley Point one is only being built because consumers has been forced to pay 3 times what electricity costs from windmills and guaranteed that price for 30 years. It's massive government subsidies that makes that happen. I think any politicians with any sane mind in Europe would look at that and say, now is not the time, and we have not seen successes. Then we can look to the east and we can look at other places where they've been faster and produce them better, right? But we know we will never accept the safety standards of China or Russia when we build nuclear, right? So I find it puzzling that we keep painting this picture that this is the solution out there, right, to the climate crisis when we have this reality around us.
So, Mads from Atomkraft Yatak, what we're hearing here is a lot of concerns. Do they resonate with you, or do you think no, that they're not valid? That shouldn't be our concern. Or how do you view it?
There's definitely concerns about the build times of nuclear reactors because we haven't built that many Western nuclear reactors in a long time, but the ones that we have built that he likes to point out have been delayed are also capable of producing green, reliable electricity in such vast quantities that it's hard to really put into perspective, but I will try my best anyways. Olkiluoto 3, the one you talked about before, took 17.5 years to build. Its yearly production, when it's online, will be higher than all Danish windmill combined. More than 10 terawatt hours, approximately 13 in fact. So even when nuclear is built the slowest possible, like when you make all the mistakes you can make when you want to build a nuclear power plant, it is still faster than wind. All the quickest transitions have been made with nuclear or hydro, but we don't have mountains, so we don't have that luxury. In regards to price, I think it's really, really unfair to compare intermittent energy sources that depend on the weather with dispatchable, reliable energy sources such as nuclear or hydropower. Because how much does an hour of electricity cost from a windmill when the wind doesn't blow? I mean, you have to ask Putin about that because I'm sure he can deliver, or maybe not. But the price of nuclear electricity is it's determined by the market, and right now we don't have enough reliable electricity in Europe, and consumers everywhere are feeling that. Our gambles on intermittent energy sources alone simply have not made a green transition because, as you mentioned, Germany, yeah, they closed down their nuclear power plants and they started burning coal and gas instead. Their CO2 emissions have flatlined, as have the Danish ones, if you account for the biomass and the higher imports that we have now. So countries that only go with intermittent energy sources simply have not succeeded in making these energy transitions that we need to make. And also, it has destabilized the European electricity grid. It is true that France's reactors, most of them are offline right now, and it is true that they are very, very bad at maintaining their reactors in France at the time. But there has not been a single nuclear disaster in Western countries that have resulted in deaths, yet still we rely on mostly burning stuff that kill millions every single year. So that is a serious problem that we must face. Like, what will be the actual substitute for the backup energy that we require if we keep building stuff that relies on the weather? Even in the international context, I also believe that nuclear is in fact living through a renaissance, because polls worldwide say that people are more and more keen to build new nuclear, and the list of countries that build new nuclear is way longer than the list of countries that don't.
So, is Greenpeace convinced by this?
No, I'm not convinced, as you would probably not expect me to be. But no, I think, you know, it's no coincidence that France have had the highest energy price, electricity price in Europe for the last 3 months now, right? And they've had the problem for 3 years in a row now, that what you call uninterrupted energy, or you call it something different, but I would call it uninterrupted energy, right? The energy that delivers year on year, right, is energy that delivers 65% of the time in France, right? For 3 years. For 3 years.
That's not true.
And now they are below 50. No, that's true.
Yeah, now they're below 50, but their capacity factor is 77%.
Not the last 3 years.
Historically.
They've been
let's
under
let
65.
one person at a time.
But the point is that this notion, in average, I think in Europe it's 85%, right? And for a offshore wind, it's 50%, right? So of course there's differences, but you also need backup for nuclear, right? Is that also wrong?
No?
No.
Good.
So I would like to also bring
So we have to be very careful in not painting this picture that we have unreliable renewables, but super reliable nuclear, right? That's not the reality of the game. Of course, there is a difference there. And I think that's also why we have to be very clear when we talk about wind and solar and look at all the different energy scenarios that shows how we can build a renewable energy system in the world, right? With renewables that are not nuclear, that it of course also takes technologies that can store energy and backup capacities. We have to have that as well, right? But the price difference right now, where we see price of renewables dropping dramatically and we see prices of nuclear rising, then we have to accept that there is a trend here that actually helps us, those of us who think that it's best without nuclear.
I would like to bring Jakob into this conversation also.
Well, wind and solar is very good, and we need more of that, but it's just not enough. Not even in Denmark, and of course not where the wind is not blowing so much. But what I would like to say, that you pointed out that the atomic, what is called the ones in Ukraine now?
Zaporizhzhia, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry.
That plant, and that's under fire at the very moment. This is, of course, very, very, very scaring. But I have heard that this is an old-fashioned, it's still scaring, old-fashioned plant made by the same way as Chernobyl was. What we are talking about here is not the same technology as the old atomic plants. We have to get new technology. And that's why I, in the very beginning, said that if we do so, the worst-case scenario is able to be handled. I am very scared about what is happening in Ukraine now. It could be a new Chernobyl. Actually, in the last week, there was no electricity on it, so they might not be able to cool. It can be a disaster. But it's a disaster because it's an old-fashioned atomic plant which has to be closed down, and we have to build some more new ones. That's what I think when I'm talking about new technology, where you made the energy in another way, and the worst-case scenario is a kind of a salt rock instead of this cloud.
isn't there, Jakob, a problem in saying this is a security question? Like we have to be afraid. We have to protect ourselves. This is the way to do it. Is that
It's about independence.
Is it about independence? Is it a policy based on fear?
No,
is that
no,
the right way to do it?
No, I will never advocate for politics into fear. Never. But it's about independence. We have to get our energy solutions, and I do not want to continue with fossils that we buy in the Middle East and gas we buy from Putin. So that's the question about independence, and that has to be, we have to make a fast solution about that. And I don't think that the Germans would have closed down the existing power plants if you not had the disaster in Japan. Because now the timing, closing down the low carbon atomic plants in Germany, and instead of beginning using coal, carbon-wise, it's stupid. And it really hurts me by the climate that we are doing so. So actually, if we believe that the worst case scenario is not that bad, then, as I said in the former debate, you and I, we cannot afford not to begin. We cannot afford not to begin, even though the price is high. It's about independence, and it's about the climate. And the climate is a worldwide fight. We have to win it.
So I will allow Mads from Greenpeace to give a short response, but after that I would like to ask if the audience have any questions. So prepare your questions now, and Mads, you get to answer this.
Yeah, because you asked, do we agree that the worst case is not bad? No, we don't agree on that, right? The worst case is very, very bad. That's the thing with nuclear. The risk, especially with third generation, the new ones, the EPRs and those who are being built now, the risk is lower than it was for Chernobyl. But the thing with nuclear is that when it goes bad, it goes very bad, right? And I think we have not seen those worst case scenarios that can happen with third generations happening. But the fact is, we've been told for decades that the chance of a nuclear accident is 1 in a million, right? The fact is, we have 439 reactors in the world in 2021, right? And we've had 3 major accidents that we all remember, yeah? And then there's a lot of smaller ones, right? So let's just be clear that this is not something that is 1 in a million. This can happen more often. Now, I think the key thing right now is to be very clear and say that we're in a situation where new builds of nuclear, if we were to, and that's what some of these energy scenarios that also the IPCC is looking at, in the optimistic scenario could double its contribution to combat climate change, etc. Double its contribution, so double what it delivers. It would take 37 reactors of a standard size a year until 2050 in order to reach that, right? And again, coming back to what has happened until now, a few to 8 a year, right? So that's just to double it. So this notion that this is what will solve, getting out of the claws of Saudi Arabia, will address climate change, it's a fantasy, right? So let's not talk about it that way, and I think that's where it becomes black and white and say, this is not the big savior that will save us all from all the things that we would love to save us from, right? When I went to university and high school, I loved nuclear energy. I still do. I think on paper this is magnificent, right? If it was possible to control it and not to have accidents, not to have all these things. Every time there's an accident, then the pro-nuclear folks says, yeah, nuclear is safe, unless there is a flood, unless there is a war, unless there is, there's all these buts around it. And I think that is the point, right? Nuclear is great in theory, but there unfortunately is some very, very difficult problems that have turned up. And we are looking at a world that is going to be more unsafe and more unstable, right? We have climate change, we have wars, we have resource conflicts. Is this the world where we want to have nuclear power stations plastered all over the world?
So now we'll take a few questions from the audience. There's a question all the way in the back.
Thank you. This is about whether nuclear is already producing the solution or not. There is an app called App Electricity Maps, and it shows all the time how is it in real time with the production. Now, at this very moment, we produce twice as much CO2 per electricity unit in Western Jutland than France does with the nuclear powers. There are 7 countries that are always greener than Denmark. France, Slovakia, and Finland with nuclear, Norway and Austria with hydro, and then there's Sweden and Switzerland who have both nuclear and hydro. You can go to Canada. Quebec is always green, they have hydro. Ontario is always green, they have nuclear. So I think the question is also, if we want a lot of green energy here, we can either build a nuclear power plant or we can build a mountain. And I think the first one is preferable.
So, the first one is preferable. I feel like Mads from Greenpeace, would you like to start off reflecting on this question?
No, but I think that's completely true, right? The facts that you listed, right? I mean, that is the reality, right? That's why we in Greenpeace have been fighting for 40 years now in order to get that energy revolution that is needed, right? An energy revolution that is based on fossil fuels energies, solar, wind, and hydro. And I think it's a tragedy, right? And I think Germany would agree. It's a tragedy that they have not acted faster than they have on renewables, right? I think the discussion around whether we should leave some of the old is a different one, which I find very difficult, to be honest, right? Also personal, because that's probably where I differ a little bit from my organization, actually, because I think that it is an emergency where we should probably leave them. That train has left the station, right? Because they've said that it's not even possible, right? But of course, those countries that have produced nuclear have a green map, right? Because nuclear is CO2 free, just as solar, just as wind are, right? But the notion that we cannot produce a renewable energy system that is reliable with solar and wind is wrong. We can do that, right? And we have right now a track in Denmark, right, with a build-out plan that is mapped out. We know what we're going to do, and I believe that that's actually one of the things in the government's climate plan that is realistic to be achieved. There's a lot of other things I would be disagreeing with, but the course that was set out already 8-9 years ago with 100% renewable for our electricity and heat production in Denmark, I think can be achieved. I think it will be possible to limit what I consider to be a problem, namely biomass in that time frame. But that's my believing that.
So, Mads from Atomkraft, Jakob, would you like to come in on this?
Sure. Well, you say that we can make this work with renewables. Sure, if you consider burning forests renewable, then yeah, we can do it. It's what we're doing in Denmark right now. But there's not a single country that has actually made a green transition with wind and solar alone, because you need safe and reliable backup. And that is simply just a matter of fact, because we need to have energy on demand all the time. And we cannot base our energy system on these new technologies that are just, well, dreams and hopes. We have to look at the countries that have actually made green transitions and are green on this map and look at what did they do. And the ones that had mountains built hydro and maybe nuclear, and the ones that didn't and that are still green, they built nuclear. And it is simply not true that nuclear is way more expensive than wind. If you look at the projected cost of electricity from the International Energy Agency, it says that nuclear is cheaper than offshore wind. And the IPCC's price models also show the same, that nuclear is cheaper than offshore wind. And again, you simply cannot compare these two energy sources without taking into the account the fact that you need some sort of backup capacity. You correctly stated that nuclear also needs some sort of backup. Sure, it can only produce 90% of the time. Sometimes you need to put new fuel in and take the old out. But there's a big difference between being able to plan these fuel changes and then the wind, which might produce in certain spots in Denmark, produce up to 50% of the time, but it is still unreliable. It is not more reliable than what meteorologists can predict, which is pretty unreliable. I think anyone can attest to that. So, like he stated, if you don't have mountains, you don't have hydro, and then you need to build nuclear if you want to be green on that map. And that way we can also have cheap electricity on demand. It is how they did it in most other countries.
Jakob, I would like to hear you maybe reflect on the potential for new energy sources? Because you say, okay, we can do more nuclear, we can work with that, but shouldn't we also look into the new ways of doing that? Isn't that always a thing we should do?
I think we should do everything.
But we can't do that. We don't have the money to do everything.
No. But actually, I don't think we disagree so much. Where the disagreements begin between you and me is at the very point whether you believe renewables is enough or not. I like renewables. I think we have to get more renewables. I just don't believe it's going to be enough, not even in Denmark. And if you regard it as a discussion for the whole world, it will not be enough. So that's where we disagree. It's not because I am against any of the other kind of energy forms that you're talking about. I am for them. But I don't believe that the world is able to change out fossil fuels without nuclear energy. I simply don't believe it. And then what drives me is independency and the climate. I know it also drives you, but you trust in renewables as a 100% energy consumption method or producing method. I don't. And I don't believe, if you regard it as a world discussion on behalf of the whole world, that we will be able to substitute fossil energy without atomic energy. I simply don't believe it.
So, okay, but Jakob does not believe it. And you, Mads from Greenpeace, believe it. So is it a question about religion? Isn't it more complicated than that? Isn't there a way that we can, is there a compromise? Is it either or? Why is this debate always ending up so black and white?
Maybe we should discuss whether it is so unsecure as it used to be, because I've just admitted to you that I am very nervous about what is happening in Ukraine now, because it is an old plant you can compare to Chernobyl. Of course, everybody would be an idiot if we were not concerned about that. And I think that kind of old plants, with or without a war in Ukraine, should be closed down. And
it's not an old plant, but I don't think that's not the point. I think
it's old technology.
The same. No, older than what? I mean, it's newer than Fukushima, if I remember right. Actually,
About the same.
Yeah. But I think it's. I think the thing is that we don't have to make this a question about belief. I mean, there are scientific studies and there are scenarios out there that shows both energy systems where nuclear play a role. There's no energy systems, there's no reviews that I'm aware of where it plays a majority role, right? No one believes that will happen in 100 years, right? But there's definitely ones where it goes from staying the same, increasing, doubling, and tripling in that vicinity, right? So I think it's in that way we have to speak about. That means the problem you talk about again is not addressed by that conundrum. That it will never be solving the bigger problem. I think it's quite clear that and just coming to the I just found the numbers here on the capacity factor on globally, right? According to the EA, it's 85% for nuclear globally, right? And in Europe, it's 75%, right? And in France, it was 65 the last 3 years on average, and now this year it has been even more dramatic down, right? So we just have to be very clear about that. It's being overstated.
What about wind globally?
Offshore wind is 50%. Yeah.
That is
onshore, it's 25%. Yeah.
So, Mads, in the end, would you like to come in for a short comment, and then we'll take some questions from the audience?
Well, yeah, sure. I'd love to address whether or not nuclear is safe or not. I mean, anyone can just Google what are the safest forms of energy. You'll be redirected to our world and data that clearly shows that if you crunch the numbers, nuclear is safer than wind. Nuclear also doesn't require fossil backup, which makes wind in that regard worse. I agree with Jakob that we need all three. If you look at how the world energy consumption is evolving, 2022 will be one of the best years for coal ever, because we have a lot of developing nations that need a lot of energy, and they need energy 24/7, and they won't get it from wind and solar, because even in developing countries it turns dark at night. We just need to look at what the IPC says, and they have 4 pathways to climate mitigation. They all involve increased proportions of nuclear, and we should probably listen to them. The International Energy Agency says the same. And then we have to look at countries such as Denmark that have vast wind resources and that have tried to make a transition with renewables, and we have failed. So if we can't do it in Denmark, no one really can.
I'll take it now to the audience. I'll just ask, how many questions are there right now? We have 2 questions, I think, all the way in the back first.
Yes, it's a question to Mads from Greenpeace. I kind of feel that you said earlier that it was impossible to put online so many nuclear power plants that we need in order to do this transition. But I kind of feel you're maybe leaving out the alternative. Like, how exactly are we supposed to do? I mean, I'm all for renewables and solar and wind, but again, we need some kind of storage or something to handle the fact that it's not. We don't have this base load. We don't have anything that can support, and we can see with the prices also now fluctuating a lot. Also showing the energy dependence in Europe that you said, but we can do the transition in Denmark, and we have hydro in Norway and Sweden and so on. But we are also connected to Germany, and so if they don't have enough power, we just have a higher electricity prices. So how exactly are we going to do this? I mean, we would have to scale up maybe 100-fold on. We're not building any battery plants or anything to store the energy from the renewables at the moment in Denmark, at least as far as I'm aware. So how are we going to do that, like more concretely? How are we going to do it without nuclear? I feel we haven't really talked about that.
I think we'll take one more question before you get to answer. So in the middle here.
Thank you. It's for Mr. Mads Flarup. The others are free to comment. We talk about projections of future energy supplies. IEA does some projections. You mentioned 4 scenarios from IPCC. I think if you read their reports, I think there were about 90. We just recently had Christopher Breyer, I believe, from Germany, run a 100% renewable scenario. It was co-authored by Sven Teske and Brian Vad Mathiesen and Mark Z. Jacobsen and Ort Hoekstra from Holland, that ilk of people. I'd very much like your take on it. In science, we sometimes talk about a consensus, like the models merge around some sort of center, and then there are outliers. When you look at the wide scope of credible institutions for energy, where do you put Mark Z. Jacobsen and Brian Vad Mathiesen and Ort Hoekstra? Do you think they're dead in the center, or do you think they're the outliers? And do you think we should have a precautionary principle, because energy is really important for human flourishing? Thank you for your opinion.
So I think we'll start here in the middle first.
It's late in the day, so I'm just trying to recap the first question. That was on the... just give me a hint. Just give me one word. Yeah, exactly, the storage thing. I mean, right now we have great storage work happening on the Fynsværket, for example. Large-scale battery, in the way that I think battery is part of the future, right? In heat, right? It's heat basins that they're basically storing the energy in. That can then be released later on, right? And I think this is exactly what most of these energy scenarios that speaks of 100% renewables talk about, right? There is a variety of ways that we will store energy. It will not be lithium batteries like Tesla produced them, right? But it will be different kinds of either hydraulic systems, it will be heat that is very promising. What's his name? Stiesdal, the Danish innovator, right, who is right now pioneering heat sinks in stones in Grenaa. So we are actually quite far on these things in Denmark already. They're doing huge experiments right now in Germany with steam storage is underground, right, which has huge potential as well. This is clearly things that are not utility scale yet, right? So there is a problem in finding the right solution. There's a lot of innovation and testing going on at the moment in that. But this is what they are pointing to as one thing. But I think the most fundamental thing in a sustainable and secure renewable energy system is one where you have very strong grid connectors and you utilize the fact that wind blow differently in different places and you can transport energy around, right? So this is where we are, right? I think the point is that it's actually not technology that is holding us back there, right? It's simply economy of scale and getting it out there, because it's basic physics that we are talking about here, whether it's hydraulics or it's heat sinks. On the energy scenario, thinking, right, I mean, let's be clear, IPC doesn't do energy scenarios, right? They are scoping the market out there, and then they are taking the ones that use, as you say, are in the middle of it. And I don't think it's unnatural that their starting point is how does the world look today, right? We have 400 reactors, there's new builds going on, I think there's around 30 new builds in the process, right? And they map out what is realistic, right? What is realistic that these can be scaled up to deliver more on. And therefore they deliver, and I think that's not an unfair, and I haven't heard any of you challenge that yet, right? That the middle ground right now is around a doubling, right? When you talk about ambitious in nuclear. Yeah. Then there are some that are more outliers on ambition, and then there are some that has a principle stand and say we do it without, and showed how it can be done without. Right? It's up for policy makers, right, and decision makers to decide which one of these scenarios to go with. But I think it's unfair to say that there's no scenarios out there that with reliability shows that we can do it without nuclear. Again, we have to be clear about what is the scale of the issue here. Right? It's the scale right now. We are implementing around 200 to 250 gigawatt a year, solar and wind globally. Right? Nuclear is somewhere between 2 and 5 gigawatt, right? So it's a factor 100 approximately right now of nuclear and of renewable, and that is rising exponential. Nuclear is not. Cost going down for renewables, cost for nuclear going up, right? So we just have to be a little mindful of the reality that is moving out there.
I would like to give it to Mads here in the end.
What I want you to really pay attention to when you asked him how will you do it without nuclear is the words promising, potential, experimenting. We cannot do it without nuclear with current technology, and at least not in an economically feasible way. And
so you want to build third generation nuclear? That's what you want to
sure.
build?
Yeah. Sure, I want to build third generation nuclear. Maybe not the EPRs, because...
Oh, not the EPRs?
No.
Okay, the Russians?
Can I finish? There's, the fastest builds right now are South Korean, so don't even try to rub that on me. But, well, you don't have storage technologies, and that is like gambling with the climate to just say, oh, well, we'll invent a solution so we can do it. Norway right now are seriously discussing cutting their cables because electricity prices are rising so much. We seriously need nuclear for this, and if we think that we can just invent something, then we are truly gambling with the climate. And yeah, that's my answer to that.
I think I'll need to give it to Jakob also.
Well, no more to add. I think the questions was for Mads in the middle.
Yes.
And so I have nothing more to add.
You have nothing more to add?
No.
Then I think I will give you, is it a short question? Okay, we can do a very short question.
First of all, thank you very much for this debate. Most debates are four people saying basically the same thing. So it's wonderful to have different opinions. My question is actually for the politicians in the room, because this is basically a political discussion. And you started, Jakob, by saying that a lot of your colleagues maybe actually believe in nuclear power as the future, but they're afraid to say it. So how do you plan to initiate this discussion in the public space so that it can be a discussion between more than 50 people in a room in my air?
Well,
I think that's a good question to end with.
yeah, it is. Maybe also my knowledge is is historic, but it has been the way in Denmark that you could not get elected if you were talking about nuclear energy. And we have had afraidness. Our perception was Nagasaki, now I am a little roughly, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island in the US in the 70s. And we haven't followed the new technology. But I can feel a breakthrough that there is a new technology. Also, maybe it's because of the climate crisis that a lot of people is trying to figure out whether this will work or not with atomic energy. And so I think you can say it now, but 10 years ago you were not able to say it. Otherwise you will be really it's uphill. It would be uphill. I'm not sure it's uphill anymore. So now it's just to begin the debate, but it was certainly not that 10 years ago. It would, and even though in my party, the youth organization KU tried to get it to vote for it should be the policy for the party. It was a big discussion because we didn't want it out in the public that we were in favor of atomic, because we knew that we would lose so many voters. So the People's Party said to the youth, the young people, don't do this. It's a bad brand. It won't be that today. Maybe because of the climate crisis, as I said. And maybe also because the new technology is much more better and the worst case scenario is more handleable. And you don't agree about that. And you know a lot more about this than me, I admit. I'm just a lawyer. But what I've been reading is that the waste is very small, and it's handleable, and it could be in a moving box when you move from house to house. It's not big size anymore, and maybe it's not fully out developed technology, but it's coming new technology. So I think we should work with this, put a lot of money into it, because I don't think we can afford not to do, and that's of course is because that I do not believe that we can get energy enough just by renewables.
Time is running out. I would like to Mads here in the end first, and then in the middle afterwards.
Yeah, I'd say that...
Very short comment.
Very short. Okay. Yeah, I agree. On the political side, a lot of stuff is happening. More than double the amount of people than 5 years ago are now for nuclear, maybe due to the climate crisis, maybe due to prices. And there are challenges with nuclear, but there are challenges with all energy sources. Currently, most of our energy is made by pumping the waste straight into the atmosphere and into our lungs. Wind and solar are also made with minerals and materials, and they also need to be deposited in a sustainable way. So that is, it's really good that nuclear has such a small waste footprint and that it has never killed anyone.
Okay, and the final comment here from Mads from Greenpeace.
How to make a final comment on that? I mean, we've been through so many topics, right? I mean, but I think on the political side, right? I mean, I think it's very difficult for Danish politicians to seriously come out and say we think nuclear is part of the solution in Denmark, right? Because there is really no argument for it, right? I mean, we actually can create a renewable energy system that is probably one of the easiest places in the world to do it. And I completely agree. It's wrong to burn the forests, right? It's wrong to use biomass, right? So we need to transition out of it. I think it's not going to be complicated for a country like Denmark to do that, right? It will take some time, but so will nuclear, right? If we did it. But imagine where to place a nuclear reactor in a small country like Denmark. Zero chance. right? So why would we even consider it? It's not needed, it would never happen, right?
We don't have more time for this debate. I would like to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being in the audience. Please give them a big round of applause.